I assume everybody has just joined and can hear me. Welcome to Active London. And if it's the first workshop that you've attended, welcome to Active London. If it's not, then I hope you've had some good sessions over the last few days. This session is all about insight and how we use insight to achieve our objectives, and how we can really explore how we use insight to tackle inequality, and what we might do differently to further our goals and our aims, including perhaps how we might work a bit more collectively. So firstly, to introduce myself, my name is Tim Copley. So I'm the Director of Insight, Technology and Data at London Sports. So it's a real pleasure to be chairing or facilitating this session. It's a topic that's close to my heart. I enjoy getting into the detail and getting under the skin of how we go about, I guess for me, about gaining the right knowledge that we need and using that knowledge appropriately to further our goals. So we've got 90 minutes to explore this. We've got a great set of guys on the workshop with us. So I'm going to introduce everybody now shortly. So firstly, we've got Sanya Hack. So she is head of research at AudienceNet. So AudienceNet are a research agency that works with a range of clients across a range of different sectors, including sport and physical activity. One of Sanya's main areas of specialisms relates to minority groups and optimizing methodologies to ensure that research more accurately represents their experiences and their views. We're fortunate to have both Tom and Rose from Sported. So many of you will know Sported, but if not, they are a leading UK sport for development organisation that support a network of around 2,500 community groups across the UK and about 350 in London. So Sported provide those groups with the skills and opportunities that they need to sustain and expand their work with young people living in some of the most challenging circumstances in our country. So we've got the benefit of Tom's more strategic partnership experience and also Rose's research and insight expertise. So welcome to you guys. And finally, we've got Lauren Kocher. So she is the senior program delivery manager at the GLA. Lauren has a background in youth work and international development, but she's a core part of the Sports Unite team at the GLA. So she plays a key role in developing and implementing the Sport Unites program, which is an important part of that is creating a monitoring and evaluation framework for what is quite a complex program. So in terms of the session format, we're going to hear from the guys, range of different perspectives, which I'm sure will be really sort of insightful and informative. We'll take a short break just to refresh ourselves, and then we'll come back with a bit of a Q&A to discuss some of the points made and talk around the subject a little bit. So there'll be questions that I'll pose, but really keen that you guys get a chance to post your questions and share your views as well. So there's a number of ways that you can really engage in this session. So you can engage in the chat function, you can post questions, and if you want, you can also raise questions verbally, but just perhaps make sure that you keep your audio and cameras off once you've asked the question. But please do feel free to get involved in this session. We're going to keep it quite informal, and yeah, we'll see where it takes us. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sanya, who's going to come at this from a perspective of, I guess, research methodologies and perhaps ensuring or how we might ensure that we get the voice of some of the communities that we really want to engage in our work. So Sanya, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. Really good to be here with you, and thank you for London Sport for having me. Essentially, so we're AudienceNet, consumer and social research agency. We do a lot of global research, as Tim mentioned, and the thing about research is you're always looking at different populations and different communities, and often going in there with little knowledge. So it's important that we get to understand populations of the communities. We can ensure that our research is valid. That's ever more important when you're looking at hard to reach and vulnerable groups, because often what we know about them at the outset is either anecdotal, or it can be through media, and often stereotypes that emerge that can be quite restrictive for those populations. So I've always believed that research is a way to enable lesser heard groups to tell their own stories in a more democratic way, and hopefully combat some of the things that are out there that are incorrect. So, but how do we get there? So if we go on to the next slide. So first of all, just broadly looking at this from the point of view of, we want to understand the cultural context within which our population group is operating, and as we know, so I'm broadly using the term culture because it's multifaceted. It's everything from race, ethnicity to area, socioeconomics, whatever it might be. But obviously, there's loads of things that it can be overwhelming, and you don't want to go down a rabbit hole of feeling like you need to look at everything. But it's just thinking for our particular area and what we're looking at, what's the most important, and what should we make sure we include? And that's critical to the validity of the research, because if you're omitting certain groups without knowing, you're actually limiting what you're able to do, and it's not a true then representation. So as one example, we know with COVID-19 and the work that I do, there's been a disproportionate impact on some minority ethnic populations, and there have been lots of conversations in the research world and bodies such as the ONS about, is the term BAME restrictive, because do we have enough data underneath about those subgroups to be able to actually look in detail? Should we disaggregate, etc.? Just as one example, if we're looking at our experiences of lockdown, so I'm a West Londoner, and so my experience of lockdown is very different to, I know, people in other parts of London. So lately I've been going a lot to kind of the Docklands area, because a lot of our team's based there, so we'll have our meetings, and it's like great fun, at least from my point of view. There's the river, you can take the boat to meetings, and there are these cool buildings, so it's almost felt like a mini holiday, especially as now travel is restricted. So if we were looking at that, maybe region, or particular area within London, and a few other elements may be enough to experience that. For other things, we might need to drill down on many more variables. So if we go on to the next slide, I'm just going to set up a couple of things that we need to look at when researching London, in particular in our case, looking at inequalities, and specifically around also sports and physical activity. So one thing to bear in mind is the diversity of our population in terms of ethnicity and background. So we've got approximately over 8 million people in London. Got a relatively even split between those who are from white backgrounds and then the non-white population. And if we look here, we've got about 45% white British, and then actually that's quite level with the non-white population, because the remainder of the white population are not British born as such. So really interesting then, if we look at the breakdown of the different ethnic groups, so we've got British Asians are the largest kind of single group, and then with African Black British just behind. We've also got something to bear in mind, that 3.4 million approximately of the London population are born abroad. So even if they're from the same ethnic group as someone, their experiences are likely to be different, because of maybe where they've grown up and how they've, what's shaped their experiences there. We've also got elements that, London is increasingly becoming more diverse. I don't know how this shapes up in years to come with sort of Brexit, etc. But certainly some minority groups have got younger age profiles. They tend to have larger households, so therefore they're growing at an increased rate. Some stats here that between the 2001 census and 2011, the white British population in London has been decreasing slightly, while some other groups have been growing. So if we go on now to the next slide. So now thinking about diversity in terms of geography and socioeconomics. So many of you may be familiar with the Index of Multiple Deprivation, which looks at factors like inequality across income, education, health, and various other indicators. So if we see for London here, as the areas get darker on the heat map, it's where areas are more impoverished, based on the IMD scale. So we've got some that are not at all, which is great news. And we've got some where we've got pockets of concentrations. And again, we need to bear that in mind. Looking at ethnicity also from the point of view of geography, you've got some areas, I think it's Brent is one particular borough where the majority population is non-white, and it's in particular South Asians, but South Asians from certain areas. So you've got higher Gujarati populations and other things. So again, we need to bear that in mind when we're doing our research and making sure we've thought about those factors. Moving on to the next slide then. Well, why is this important from the point of view of activity, is levels of activities, because we know that a few of these factors do correlate with lower levels of activity. So ethnicity, we've got lower levels amongst some BAME populations and also across socioeconomics. What's been interesting is since lockdown, looking at, I know, Sport England and other data about how some groups have actually increased levels of activity because you've got more access online, but then there's been ups and downs, and we're kind of, those themes are generally continuing. So it is something important for us to look at that when we're looking at levels of activity and inequalities in London. Moving on then to the next slide. So in terms of research then, just to kind of sum up, if we're looking at London and researching London and generally, but also in terms of activity, we need to make sure we've got a good representation across our boroughs. In terms of ethnicity, again, ensuring we've got a good proportion of our non-white ethnic groups, and within those groups, specific ones, and not just clustering them. And this can be really quite difficult in traditional research in recruitment because they're not readily available on panels, or you need specialist recruiters. So that can make it challenging. And then in terms of restrictions, so we do a lot of work around London and looking at the socioeconomic and technological restrictions, where you've got areas where there's less internet access, or the costs of taking an online survey on your phone may be prohibitive. So we use free SMS numbers or paper surveys. So again, just bearing all of that in mind when you're designing and delivering and getting the research back. So the next slide, please. So now thinking, just about the research approach and how do we achieve validity and access. So a couple of things we do is from the outset, we'll include experts. So we'll seek the advice of experts, again, trying to prevent us going into that rabbit hole of looking at everything and then it feeling overwhelmed, or it becomes too expensive or time consuming. So these could be academic specialists, it could be community leaders, it could be civic organizations. We've just late last year, finished a project amongst the Hasidic Jewish population, where we reached out to rabbis and leaders of a newspaper, and they were great in helping us design and ensure we were getting the right population. That's great. Just it sort of gives you that contextual knowledge from the outset. Then in a more ongoing way, we work with what we call cultural mediators, and we've built a team of them across a range of different groups that we cover. So these, more than just translators, they've got an important working knowledge of the population. They're able to help us look into new things that we hadn't considered, or interpret the data in ways that is more, I guess, authentic than we may be able to achieve. So we'd definitely suggest having people on your team that can, come in and consult or advise. And then just critically getting the terminology right. Obviously, we are coming at it from a place of not knowing necessarily how someone might perceive certain things that we ask. So just making sure we check that with our experts and our mediators, so as not to put people off taking part in the research, them feeling like, why should they do this? Are we just going to portray them in the wrong way? The work we've done with refugees in the past, this has been really critical because they're worried, about how the data is going to be used because it's been misused in the past. So just getting that tone right. And then just final slide is about the how you do the data collection. Now, this sort of research is not always straightforward. So it's not like one of those where you can put a bow on it and it's like the perfect research study that's super scientific. It is scientific, but you need to roll up your sleeves, because often you're needing to use a range of different data collection methods for that same population, just to account for the access. So again, if our participants aren't able to take part because of online access or language or ethnic matching, or not, in some cases they may not want that, then you're restricting again populations and impacting validity. So here's a range of different things that across a suite of research methods that could be applied. So online surveys, video obviously right now is really critical. I mentioned the SMS side of things. So oftentimes now you're getting data from these various different elements and you're having to throw it in and triangulate and analyze it all as one. So it's being comfortable with, you might have missing data on something. So something we did in Tower Hamlets was our SMS survey. We could only have 5 questions. So those taking that would only answer the 5 critical things. Everyone else would answer a longer survey. Though it does become difficult in that sense, you get incredibly rich insight. And what I know is that we're able to then, I feel, make more impactful change and actionable change, rather than just doing something super scientific and a really nice research project, but it kind of fails to meet our objectives in that way. So yeah, I think just it's fun, get creative, it's innovative, it's challenging, but I think it's definitely needed if we're going to do this correctly. So that's it from me. from the presentation side of things, and yeah, looking forward to discussions.
Thank you, Sanya. That's really interesting in terms of how we, from a research perspective, engage with the populations that we really need to. And I think maybe when we get into the conversations, it might be good to actually explore whether we're actually doing that well enough within the physical activity and sport world. And it'd be interesting in the views of you guys as well, who actually perhaps work in the sector on that. I like that. Love that picture, by the way, the thank you picture at the end. That's great.
I know. Thank you.
Cool. Great. Thank you. We're going to move on to the Sported guys, Tom and Rays. They are coming at it a slightly different perspective from, well, they'll talk about it themselves, but principally maybe around engaging with their network of organisations and insight from that kind of community organisational level. So I'll hand over to you.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Afternoon, everyone. Particularly grateful to be here, part of the conversation. Insight plays a really important part of all that we do at Sported to ensure that we can meet the needs of our member groups, but also to share their experiences with stakeholders and partners and funders right across the UK. So I'm going to talk from my perspective at Sported. So I'm not a research expert, and that may become clear very quickly, but I'm really interested in the results of what we generate through our insight in terms of creating those partnerships, those investment strategies, and that change that we really want to see in community sport. My colleague Rose Chilton is also with me, our insight manager, who is an expert, thankfully, so she can help me later on, in particular with any questions that are particularly challenging, I guess, and really helpful in terms of thinking about how we could more collaboratively work together as we think about the future opportunities. So I'm going to briefly cover four things. The challenges of insight that we have faced over our lifetime as Sported, some of the key learnings that we've generated, the strange opportunity that COVID has presented for us, and the change that that's creating in terms of our future plans. So before I do that, and although Tim referenced a little bit about us at the start, and I am hoping some of our members are actually on this call, I just wanted to just reflect a little bit on who we are in London. So as Tim mentioned, we have over 350 grassroots community organisations within our network in London. Each of them use sport to achieve a social outcome, whatever that may be, maybe around community cohesion or employability or inequality of opportunity, a whole raft of different things they use sport and physical activity for. Our role is to help them to deliver that. So we're not interested in the sport piece per se. We're interested in the opportunity that sport creates in the lives of those young people that they work with. And as you can see from the slide here, there are a number of those organisations operating in some of the most deprived parts of London and tackling some of the biggest issues that Londoners face every day. And importantly for us, I think we're supporting a community workforce that often is entirely volunteer-led and is operating on a very small amount of income. So in terms of their own capacity and bandwidth, if you like, to engage with insight, we have to be really careful about how we work with them to ensure that we're not overloading them. So if we move to the next slide, I can perhaps talk about some of our challenges in a bit more detail. So we've been working for 12 years now with our groups across London, and we've had a number of I wouldn't call them failures, but challenges as well as successes. And I think we've learned a lot during that time. And these are just some of the words that almost represent the challenges that we've faced. So things like engaging volunteers who have incredibly busy lives, who are trying to manage just purely the running of their operation. Things like the understanding of the benefit of insight and the value that it creates for them as well as for other organisations. Things like the format of the kinds of questions and the mechanisms we use to capture the answers to those questions, and just a sort of general understanding of where does this fit for the community organisations that we're asking questions of, how relevant is it and why do they need to be involved. The final point I put as a challenge for us, but I think there's a challenge generally for us as a sector, and that is the over consultation in some cases of particular parts of the sector, the community, if you like. And so we are very protective about what we ask our groups and how often we ask them and what happens to the results of what they share with us. And we've found over time that a number of them have said to us, we get asked a lot, we're consulted a lot, but we can't tell you really what the impact of those consultations is often. So there can be almost a mistrust or a challenge about people coming and asking questions without a clear understanding of where that's going to head to. So if we move to the next slide, we can just really summarize that, I suppose, in what the four key things I think we've learned through our experience. And one of the main reasons that we're able to achieve what we do in terms of our insight is because of the connection that we've developed with the groups we work with. So we have a small team working across London, but they have developed over the course of the 12 years very trusted relationships with a large proportion of the groups that we work with. So we're known to them. They understand what we're about. They respect the work that we're trying to do in support of them. And so that connection, that existing connection, is already there, meaning that when we approach them with things, they kind of recognize who we are. They understand where we're coming from in terms of the kinds of things we're likely to know and the kinds of things we're likely to do with the information they provide. We also want to be really clear about the value for this. I've written there, who is this for? Is this for us? Is this for general interest within the sector, or is it purely for the benefit of the organizations that we're trying to support? So we really want to be really careful about what we're asking and as I say, where that goes and what the intended benefit is for those communities. And related to that really is the subject matter. So clearly, we spent some time asking things that we thought were actually very interesting for our community groups. They clearly didn't. They didn't resonate at all. So actually finding that sort of those things where groups are really engaged, really sort of fired up about things. A great example currently is the Black Lives Matters piece, where we've been doing a really good piece of focus group work, which clearly there's a hugely passionate voice surrounding. So that's a really good example of where the subject matter really drives the level of engagement that we really want to see. And finally, from a practical perspective, just the challenge of when and how to input. So just as Sania put in her piece there, you need a range of different techniques, simple and more complicated perhaps, to provide the opportunity for everyone to get engaged in the way that they want to. So next slide, please. So ironically, COVID-19 has almost provided a sweet spot, if that doesn't sound too wrong a word, but in terms of our research and insight, a sweet spot of all those things coming together for us in terms of the ability to tackle a really relevant issue that our members feel very passionately about, where we really knew we had a role to help. And so we very quickly did two things. We developed a community pulse survey with the intention of reaching as many of our members as we could, and really gauging what it was they needed. And for two reasons. Firstly, to help shape our response. So what free services and benefits could we offer to our members that they really, really told us that they needed urgently? And secondly, to collate that information and pass it on to a range of stakeholders, including those, and others, that might allow them to think about how they formulated their response. And we had over 800 responses actually in the end. And this is just a couple of graphs taken from the report that we generated. And tracking that over time and sort of really focusing in on where our members needed support most proved incredibly helpful, both for us and for the 40-odd stakeholder groups we shared that information with. Moving on to the next slide, we also wanted to dig deeper into that because there were some particularly worrying or important issues that were raised through that. And we were finding that the quantitative survey approach wasn't giving us all we needed. So actually developed a number of focus groups where we actually allow groups to really take the lead in the conversation and really talk to us about what it was that was playing on their minds, the kinds of solutions they felt were really achievable, the kinds of things that weren't. And again, just thinking about how we adapted our insight gathering over the course of time. So we realized we couldn't keep asking large-scale questions to a large number of groups and expect a good response, but actually focusing in on a smaller number but a deeper level of input was really helpful for us. We also instituted a question of the week. So just a really very simple social media question responding to one thing that had come through from our members during that week, which was just an opportunity for them to click yes or no. Is this an issue for you right now? Or to what extent do you agree with this point? Which again allowed us to be really nimble and agile in terms of our gathering of insight around issues that we were seeing coming up and wanting to respond to. So I think it's proven really valuable for us to kind of see that. And I think for us, there's now a longer term impact on the way that we gather our insight and the central nature in which it plays in how we do what we do. And I've tried to capture some of that here. So I think the first thing for us is I've used the word partnering here with community groups to gather insight. So this is about working together with our network and with other stakeholders to make sure there's much greater levels of alignment and understanding about what we're trying to achieve through our insight gathering. So how can we really make sure that this is benefiting all parties to equal degrees in terms of what we're trying to capture? And I think to achieve that, we want then our network to have a greater understanding of what insight is and the benefits of it. We've done quite a bit of research with our network to help them understand the greater benefits of insight and impact, some things that they don't necessarily naturally gravitate towards in their day-to-day work, but actually trying to help understand and unpack more of that and create the space and the tools for them to be able to get involved more with the world of insight. For us at Sported, it's definitely meant the need to create a deeper connection between insight and program design. And of course, we have that to some degree already, but I think this has really demonstrated the role that our groups need to play in the starting, the middling and the finishing of the programs that we develop for them. But we recognize that needs to be done by an increased amount of dialogue with them. So shorter inputs more regularly to create almost a kind of two-way dialogue that really can create a greater sense of partnership there. And clearly that for us involves tech. I think there's definitely a role for that. We've just started using an app, a really exciting app that I think will help us both in terms of capturing insight, but also finding great ways of sharing the voice of those in communities that we work with more directly, which is really what we want to do. We want to amplify their voice rather than take anything away from that or modify it ourselves. And I think the final point I'd perhaps make here is about working together. So I think Sani has mentioned it already, but for us, we can achieve so much more by working together with a variety of different stakeholders, ensuring we don't duplicate our work, but actually think about where we have our collective strengths and weaknesses. And I think one of the things I'm hopeful for from this meeting this afternoon is that we'll get to some of those kinds of questions and some practical ways that we might start thinking about working together more closely. So I hope that's helpful as a starting point, and look forward to picking up on some questions in a bit.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. There's a few bits that jumped out for me there, but a couple of them in particular perhaps is the one about trust and understanding. So having that connection and relationship with those organizations as almost like a foundation, and then only then perhaps can you then start to share knowledge, work in partnership, share information much more. So I think that kind of notion of partnership networks came through really well. I think the other bit for me is around the sort of bit you mentioned about COVID-19, and there's been, not surprisingly, a lot of discussions over the course of the last 3 or 4 days around the implications of COVID, etc., good and bad. But I think it feels there's a lot of discussion about how we do things differently, and it applies to insight and research as well as actual the nuts and bolts of delivery and supporting organizations as well. So I think some of the things you said about the sort of agility to respond and sort of gain the pulse of the organizations that you work with is something that hopefully will endure beyond obviously the COVID-19 period. So thank you very much. We are going to move on to Lauren, last but no means least. So Lauren is going to give the perspective of the GLA and in particular the Sport Unites programme. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, hi everyone. As Tim mentioned, I'm the Senior Programme Delivery Manager for the sport team at the Greater London Authority. And I work primarily on a programme called Sport Unites. And kind of similar to Tom, the way we want to use evaluations and analysis of data is to influence policy and to showcase the impact that the community sports sector has on the lives of Londoners. So it's very important for us. So if you could just move to the next slide. So just a little bit about Sport Unites. It's the Mayor's flagship community sport programme, and it supports its long-term vision to make London the most active and socially integrated city in the world. This programme harnesses the power of sport to bring people from different backgrounds together, strengthen our communities whilst improving physical and mental health of Londoners. So we fund valuable initiatives across the capital, as well as running pilot projects and supporting the community sports sector workforce. And as you can see on the slide, the projects we support use sport and physical activity to tackle 5 key social issues: social mixing, social isolation, inactivity, mental health, and serious youth violence. So we've moved away from simply reducing inactivity to recognising that sport has a more vital role to play in supporting Londoners through those social issues. But that obviously means that it's quite a complex programme. So if you could move on. So today I wanted to talk to you about how we measure impact within Sport Unites, the challenges that we face and are continuing to face, and where we see the future of insight and impact measurement for the community sports sector. Next slide, please. So as you can see, our insight work has been developed through a partnership with InFocus. So through a procurement process, InFocus became our delivery partner for monitoring, evaluation and learning. They're experts in evaluating sport for development projects, so we felt they're best placed to support us to develop a new framework for this programme. And as Sport Unites was a new programme, it began as several pilots. InFocus came in about halfway through and supported that development of the framework to pull together the learning so far as well. For us, the most important thing at that point was that everything was outcome driven. So, and that those outcomes and indicators linked to the wider policy backdrop and to the MERS strategy. Everything we fund and everything we continue to work on is outcome driven, and it fits into this framework to make sure that we're as effective as we can be in achieving our mission. And of course, just like everyone else, we've had to pivot, we've had to respond in many different ways throughout the life of the programme. But obviously, the most notable of those changes has been because of COVID-19. So we developed a series of risk forms for our grantees to notify us of any adaptations they'd need to projects. And as a signatory of the London funders, we've been really flexible with the way that funding has been used during this period. So this has meant that initial targeted outputs might not always be met, but because we're outcomes focused, the impact that we've seen has still been notably positive because Londoners were really well supported by the community sports sector, just in a really different way to what was initially planned. So it's been really interesting, and actually we're bringing out a report on the sector's response to COVID-19 in the coming weeks, just to show how essential that support has been. And then lastly on that slide, for us, Sport Unites is also always about supporting the sector and particularly the workforce. So grantees of Sport Unites receive support from InFocus in a number of ways, including impact measurement and management workshops at the start of their delivery period, so they can understand data collection and reporting tools, one-to-one support where necessary, and 3 levels of online training as well. And every grantee has access to all of that. So if you could move on to the next, thank you. So this, I'm not going to go into loads of detail, there's a lot of information there. This is our theory of change, our Sport Unites theory of change, which was developed as part of the framework. So as I said, it's too long to go into lots of detail, but you can see that we've included 2 other outcomes along with the 5 social issues that we tackle. So we've included building organisation and actor capacity and building systems capacity. And that's because we feel that our programmes have the ability not only to tackle the 5 key issues, but also to lead the way in improving the infrastructure and supporting the workforce. But obviously, the reason it's in the theory of change is because we need to be able to measure this in order to prove the importance of the community sports sector. So you can see that all of the activities we support are part of an outcome pathway which leads to the overarching impact of London becoming an active and more socially integrated city. Next slide, please. So obviously there have been and continue to be challenges in our approach to impact measurement and management. So firstly, what we did before, as the programme was a series of pilots, there wasn't always a simple uniform way to evaluate them, and that's the case in a lot of big programmes. So this meant that when InFocus came on board, it took a lot of work and time for them to bring all the data together from previous years to build a clear picture. And the lesson there really is to try and be as uniform as you can from the start. by having a clear measurement framework which pulls together every element of your plan and the outcomes you want from the overarching programme. Secondly, we work with a lot of different grant management companies or organisations, and they all have their own systems, they all work in their own ways. And that means that pulling together data and insight using different tools and techniques is obviously not always easy. And again, in Focus, have worked extremely hard to make sure that our data collection tools are compatible with other systems and that they can easily pull data together to get that clear picture. Then, of course, we're talking about inequalities as a whole today as well, and that is also clear across our insight measurement. We work with a huge range of grantees, from individuals with very small grants to large organisations with multi-year £100,000 grants. So, of course, we don't ask those who are just applying for a small amount to provide the same insight information as those with, say, £100,000, but we do still need to gather data and information. And of course, all grantees will have differing levels of resourcing, differing levels of need, and differing levels of knowledge. So we've tried to level the playing field by providing that support to the sector, which I mentioned earlier, but we want to continue to do this in phase 2 and make this even better. And then fourth is showcasing impact. So we all know that the community sport in London delivers amazing results for local people, but these results are still not always fully recognised by the most important, well, say the most, by important stakeholder groups, not the most important. This is always going to be a challenge because we want to support all grantees to show the impact of their work in order to remain sustainable. And again, as I mentioned, there are differing levels of resourcing and knowledge, and Tom mentioned this as well. So, you know, it's never going to be easy to be able to get everyone to the level where they're able to showcase it really easily. But working within Focus, we've managed to pull together the work of the sector as a whole so we can showcase that impact. But we've also delivered a series of learning communities with them, which allows grantees to share best practice. It provides that validation, and essentially it closes the feedback loop as well. And we're also working for phase 2 of Sport Unites to provide further support for organisations in this area to reduce those gaps. And then this leads quite nicely onto our plans and ideas for the future of insight within the sector. Yeah, next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So I'm not going to go into lots of detail about the Pan London framework because it's very, very early stages. But we've been having conversations with various organisations in the sector, including SportEd and London Sport, about a coalition approach to measuring insight. And what we want to ensure is that important stakeholder groups are able to fully recognise and appreciate the positive effect that community sport has on Londoners. So we want to have this collective approach to impact measurement and management through a common measurement framework. And this will obviously be complex because every organisation has their own agenda, but to have a common thread throughout our measurement of our work will be key to allowing us to more effectively demonstrate the impact that the sector has and make adaptations where necessary. We also want to support organisations to become more insight-led. This is becoming a standard way of working in other sectors. So if you look at incredibly successful companies like Apple, Google, Facebook, you can see they're all insight-driven rather than simply relying on quantitative data. Obviously, I'm not suggesting we act completely like them, but the same could be said for non-profit organisations. You know, as funders become more alive to the fact that outcomes are more significant than outputs, then the organisations need to follow suit. And a lot of that starts with supporting your workforce to be more innovative and insightful and to use their experiences and understanding of the beneficiary to constantly adapt and improve the work you're doing. And we'd like to help the community sports sector to work in that way, to not just rely on numbers, but to consider need, outcomes and impact as a whole, and use this qualitative knowledge to be creative and drive the direction of your organisation. So it means that insight gained from projects should actually touch every aspect of the organisation and where you want to go. And a key element of our phase 2 proposal will be to include a tiered organisational development offering, as well as further support to the workforce to help become more insight-led. And then lastly, another element of our phase 2 proposal is to better showcase the impact of our work. We'd like to develop a think tank which will provide a new research piece every 6 months on a particular topic within the community sports sector, and targeting a particular audience like national governing bodies, government departments, etc. And each of these will result in a publication, as well as a thought leadership event or a conference, or potentially even a grant fund, depending on the outcome of the publication. So I just want to caveat here that these are just our proposals for the future. And as we all know, nothing is set in stone, especially at the moment. So I wouldn't want to promise anything, but I think it's important for us particular funders to be innovative in how we could more effectively showcase the work of the sector. And that is everything from me for now. So thank you for listening.
Great, thank you, Lauren. I think it's a great example of an approach where you've really started and focused on the outcomes from the start, and then designed a sort of monitoring and evaluation and research approach around that. And then in addition to that, a great example where the activities and the intentions around sport and physical activity feed into a wider, broader, something that's much broader than sport and physical activity. That's the outcomes that are a priority for London. So I think you can really see how then sport and physical activity is contributing to those societal outcomes. So yeah, I think it's a fantastic approach. We're getting some great questions. We've got 3 already. We'll make sure we get into those. And I am slightly itching to get into the questions in the discussion, but I did say we'd have a break. So I think it's only right that we do. So it's 15:42. It's just ticked over as I looked at it. Let's reconvene at 15:47. 5 minutes. I would suggest keeping your don't do anything to the platform. I just leave it running if I was you. Okay, so reconvene in 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, can everybody, I assume people can hear me and nothing's changed. So we're going to crack into the questions. I'll kick off and then I'm taking an active view of the questions being posed and integrate those hopefully as appropriate. So my first question is, it's a slightly selfish one in a way, because it's something that I think about quite a lot from the London sport perspective. It's one around how the use of evidence and insight has changed within sport and physical activity over the recent period. Just any reflections on that, particularly, I guess, to Rose, Tom, and Lauren, and the sort of core challenges. Although you obviously mentioned some of those in your presentations, but what do we do? What do we need to do more of? I think because I think over the previous, certainly since I've been at London Sport for 5 years, the use of insight research has changed and become a lot more central to our way of working. So any reflections from you guys? Maybe Tom or Rose first. Oh, I think you might be on mute, Tom.
Yeah, haven't managed to work that out after 6 months of using Zoom and things. Yeah, I'm happy to kick off. I think for us, clearly the value of insight has grown even more so within the recent period and become absolutely central to everything we do, which sounds strange that it wasn't before, but I don't think that's kind of the case. But just the sort of centrality of it to everything we do has become really important. And I think we're already reflecting on what's likely to come in future years, quite frankly. I mean, who knows what the future looks like, right? But I think what we do know is there's going to be a real challenge around funding and support for groups. So evidence-based decisions become even more important in the light of that, I think. And I think being really clear about what it is we're wanting and why, and being able to really stack that up with insight and evidence has never been more important, probably. And I think Lauren, a second to that, I think Lauren made a really interesting point about what's happened during the recent months, which is that many funders and partners and stakeholders have relaxed their view of what organisations have been required to deliver for funding that they've received, which is great, and has meant that there's been an ability for organisations to do what they want to do with the money, what they feel best with the money. And I think there's some funders where normally you're almost trying to shoehorn yourselves. This is certainly what our groups tell us. They're trying to sort of fit what the funder wants in a way that isn't always really helpful for them. So I think that sort of flexibility that's been generated in the last few months is a really interesting piece to say, what will that mean in future? Will that continue to be the case where funders actually, just like Lauren described for the GLA, become absolutely outcome focused, and how you get there is flexible, or will there be almost a reverting to some of the previous ways where actually that flexibility hasn't been quite there, and there's been a sort of rigidity which doesn't actually lend itself to some of the community workforce?
Great, thank you. Any views from your angle, Lauren, on that in terms of the use of evidence and research and how it's changed within perhaps the GLA and maybe the organisations that you work with?
Yeah, I agree with Tom. I mean, in particular at the moment, the use of insight is probably more important than it has ever been. But that's not to say it was never important. It just wasn't seen as important. But I think organisations are starting to, and funders especially, are starting to realise how much of a difference it can make because of the competition. But I think there's kind of two things that we need to do really, and sort of as funders and as kind of maybe larger organisations, we need to be, as I mentioned in my presentation, we need to be more collaborative. We need to be working together much more, and we need to kind of learn from things like the London Community Response Fund, which came about because of COVID. All these organisations and funders working together, collaborating. Obviously, it's not specific to insight, but it's clearly working for both the funders and the grantees. And for a system to work, it needs to work on both levels. So this is kind of a model that you could use in non-crisis times as well. And I think it does link to that shared measurement idea that you're learning what works, what doesn't work. It helps people to understand what they should be funding. But also, I think at the same time, organisations should look to other sectors and what other sectors are doing in this area. And my background is international development, and that sector has focused on outcomes and impact for quite a long time. And you can see that because through the new techniques and technologies that have been developed to support that. So, like Tom mentioned, an app that they're using at Sported now, and you're going to see more and more of that coming out, that have potentially been developed because of the international development sector. And there's things like outcome harvesting, online communities, ethnographies. There's lots of different ideas that you could take from other sectors that I think we haven't tapped into enough in ours.
Yeah.
Great. And that's a good segue actually probably to Sanya, who has, perhaps that broader experience in terms of research and insight. So I'm interested to kind of know about your perceptions of the insight world within sport and physical activity, sort of as you sort of dip into it and then probably go back out to other sectors, other commercial organizations, and both from how insight is used and the culture within those organizations, but also maybe some of the methods actually that we could borrow, if that's the right term.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's been really fascinating. So what's interesting is what Lauren and Tom are both saying about now using these apps and other things to get a lot of data. So for example, we work a lot in music where our clients have got a lot of data and streaming, let's say. So they've got that. That's great because, things are uniform, as Lauren's saying. That is critical to be able to make broader decisions with funding and stuff. So you kind of level that playing field a little bit to see what you're looking at. And what's nice is then we're able to be more innovative and dynamic and actually being forced to by our clients to come up with cool ways of looking into problems. Like some of the work we're doing with London Sport at the minute is that. So we're going on local safaris and then we're just doing things differently, which is nice because you get that measurement and then you get the richness of doing something a little differently, which in looking at the whys essentially. So I do feel like now we're starting to move in that direction within the sports sector once we're getting these elements in place. Great,
thank you. I think all of you, highlighted the potential certainly in collaboration, and there was sort of a suggestion that we could be perhaps doing more to collaborate for greater impact against our sort of common goals. Do you want to just expand on that? I think maybe talk about the sort of shared measurement and anything else that we could potentially do, because I certainly sort of have that sort of sense that if we combine forces, more could be achieved, particularly in the sort of insight and data world. So I don't know who wants to sort of jump in on that one and share their views on it.
I can start.
Go for it.
I think so. Obviously, I did talk about this a bit in my presentation, so I won't go over that again. But I think if you look at it from so that was from a GLA perspective when I was talking about it in my presentation. But if you look at it from a kind of a grassroots organisation perspective, they might be thinking, well, yeah, okay, that's great. I'm glad you're doing that, but what does that really mean for me? And actually, I think what we need to be supporting grassroots organisations to do is to understand how sharing best practice and learning from each other can really help to kind of be innovative and adapt and be as effective as possible. And this has started and it's definitely happening. It's been happening a lot more with COVID. People have I've really seen like the collaboration and the working together. We've had learning communities that have been set up in order to specifically be able to share best practice, so grantees can just chat to each other and figure out the best way to do things. But also things like building on things like the Upshot F-word conference that they did last year. So learning from failure, but working together to kind of figure a way out of that. I think that's kind of the sort of where I would look at it from a grassroots perspective. And then from the GLA perspective, it's basically what I was saying in the presentation is sort of building upon that LCRF experience, the London Community Response Fund experience, and how well it has worked collaborating with other funders, and sort of not losing that, because that was a specific thing for COVID. It still is. But you know, as Tom said, when we're out of crisis times, how do we make sure we continue with that kind of common thread that goes throughout? And I think insight measurement is a way to do that quite well.
Okay. Thank you, Lauren. Any views from anyone else on the sort of the potential of collaboration and how we might go about it?
Rachel, don't you give some experience from the coalition, from your?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think part of sort of various informal groups of insight or research people in different organisations, and I think those are all very much based on sort of personal relationships, and there's a lot more that we could do to share those things more formally. And as I understand, that will be part of the role of the Sport for Development Coalition, who've just recruited a new leader, and then they also have a insight position. And I think a lot of what they'll be doing is creating these sort of more formal channels to share. And Lauren, I was also thinking back to the F Word conference as well, and about what we can do, what more we can do there. And I think some of that is about showcasing where insight has changed what we're doing. So maybe we all thought this is how it was, and then because of our insight we realized it was actually this way, and being more open and honest about those changes that have been made.
Great, thank you guys. I'm going to take some questions from the feed that's coming in. We've had some really good questions. Some are directed at particular people. So the first one to Sanya. You mentioned about cultural mediators, and the question is whether they're in an internal team or are they available for sector partners to consult advice on particular projects or programs. I think you're muted, Sanya.
I was, sorry, embarrassing there. I really went into my answer there, so now I'll start again. No, but just to say, I think just related to that last point, I think what's critical is to demystify research a little bit, because especially if you're not on quote unquote like research, it can feel intimidating. And I think especially with what we're looking at, if it's community organizations, and not to talk myself out of a job, but you may not have like we say, the funding to be able to get an external research partner. So just getting comfortable with that, that you can do research in different ways. And so related to this, the cultural mediators, often they're, you know, we've got now a good base built up of people that worked with us in different projects, but it's a case of going out and finding them, right? So it could be like people on the ground that become your champions that you then use in other forms of research. So there's no kind of, you know, you don't have to go and find an expert cultural mediator. You sort of make them, and you find people that you think would help in that space. So yeah, I'd say like they could be people as part of, you know, your delivery network, and you can find people that could become your champions. So if that helps at all, yeah, you kind of go out and just find and make them, really.
That does relate to a question actually I had, I guess, about accessibility of research and insight, and that kind of notion that, oh, you know, it's a scary, hard thing to do. And I think I share the opinion that you voiced, that, you know, everybody probably does sort of elements of insight. And I wonder, does anyone have an opinion about how we make it more accessible, or reduce any perceptions that it's, you know, it's not for me, you know, I can't engage in this, or I can't do it, or shouldn't do it, because yeah, I think asking some opinions of your members at your club is insight, and so I think that we do have more to do around making it more accessible, I guess. I just wondered if anybody had a particular sort of shared that view, or not, or how we might reduce any of the barriers that exist.
I think we definitely share the view, Tim, and I think we've done quite a lot of research through our capacity model, which identifies as impact, the sort of use of the understanding of impact, and the articulation of impact, the evidencing of impact is one of the things that community groups that we support find most difficult. And part of that is, as Sanya said, I think about the language. So outcomes, you know, outputs, inputs, all of those sorts of things. If you're not, you know, if you're not used to that kind of language, understanding what that means and what that means in your context can be totally bamboozling. And it's almost worse than that in a sense, because it can also really limit you from securing funding, because a lot of funders talk about outcomes and impact and so on in a way that community groups don't always understand. So we've developed a program called an Impact Practice Journey, which we take a number of our groups through, which really helps to demystify that. So that's a kind of more formal way of tackling it. I think it's not a clever answer or anything, but one of the best ways of doing it is actually connecting people to talk about what they do and to share that experience. So we find, meetings like this, or opportunities for groups to get together and discuss what they do and how they do it and what benefit that derives for them, I think is really, really helpful. Because often it's just about improving their delivery. So that's what, if it's something that relates to that, I think groups really want to know and understand it, right? If it's more about funders, that's a different kind of question almost. But actually, if it's saying, well, tell me how you do this, how do you know that works? That's the kind of basic question, isn't it, when you're talking about delivery and having the intended impact you want it to. So I think it's a bit of work on our part to try not to get too jargon laden, but it's also a bit of just general connections to allow people to share what works for them and not make it overcomplicate it.
Yeah. I totally agree, Tom. I think more opportunities like this, more kind of learning communities, more spaces for people to just talk about what they do and how they do it is really important. And I think from a funding perspective, you're right, we need to be a bit clearer about what we mean by all these terms. But also I think something we're trying to do more of is have this kind of Funder Plus offering, where we are able to provide that kind of support, so organizations that may not have the knowledge or the experience in that area can build it up in order to then gain investment. So it's something that I think more funders need to do, and we definitely want to do more of, but obviously if we can.
So it's about finding ways to almost like support organizations or give them the space to reflect on what worked or what didn't work, and not talk about research, just say, how was it for you? How did, what was your experience? And then try and collect some of that and share it. Yeah, absolutely. There's a question for the sporty guys, it's related to points that you made. They're looking at sporters' experience. Would there be value in place-based projects having this sort of rolling panel research built into their regular monitoring and evaluation? So I think it was the point about the surveying work that you'd been doing during COVID, and whether whether other, it could be translated, I guess, into other contexts, particularly around place-based work. So
Rose, do you want me to start with that? I mean, the simple answer is yes, it could be. We'd love to do more of that. And I think one of our strategies at Sported is to focus more on place-based. So the joining of community groups that operate in a given area, to allow them to tackle issues that are specific to that area, and who we don't need to define how big that area is. It could be a few streets, it could be a ward or a borough, or that's to be determined really, I guess. But I think there's definitely an opportunity to capture more data on a regular basis. That's kind of what I was trying to get to, with almost an ongoing dialogue that exists between a network like ours and us, that allows us to continually evolve and shape what we're doing in a way that we've managed through COVID. That's been the great thing for us, is that we've managed to sustain a dialogue through various forms of interaction with our groups that allowed us to adapt our services, to talk to funders, to do all the things that we'd love to do on an ongoing basis. And I guess the point I'll make again is we don't want to lose that now. So how can we create the capacity for ourselves or the support for our groups to be able to do that on an ongoing basis? And I think that's a real challenge, but it's a massive opportunity if we could manage it. I think we'd create such a strong feeling of interdependency and interconnectedness. I think that actually would really, really benefit the sector as a whole.
Great. I've got a follow-up question, I guess, about place-based working, which is, we've discussed it quite a lot over the last 3 or 4 days at Active London, and it relates, I guess, to I guess the complexity of place-based working, perhaps where you're not necessarily just delivering a single program or a project within an area. It's perhaps looking at all the kind of broader system change that's going on, and the policies and the facilities, the built environment. And I don't know, has anyone got any views about how we're adapted or how we're able to understand some of that complex stuff? And I think it's fine to say that we don't have an answer at the moment, but perhaps I just wondered if anyone had any experience of exploring place-based work and picking it all.
I'm happy to go from our perspective. I mean, I think just generally, place-based work is obviously all about context. So it's kind of about who's involved and who's around the table, because what works for Tower Hamlets might not work in Kensington and Chelsea, but it might for a minority, and you're still going to have disenfranchised young people in Kensington and Chelsea, but the issue might not be as prolific. It might be because of different things and that kind of thing. So I think it's obviously, there's multiple levels. The borough level tends to hide what's going on at the estate level, and you could have one end of the road that's completely different context to the other end of the road. Particularly in London, you have affluence living next door to poverty. And I think that what we've tried to do in our work with Model City, which is with Laureus and Nike, is it's really important for us in this area, because it's a program that aims to improve social integration through sport by empowering local people to drive the change that they want to see. So they form the coalitions, they go for the funding together, they decide what they need in that area. And that's kind of one program, but that's something that we want to definitely do more of. And like I said, I think anything that you're doing in that area, you need to have the right people involved, and those are the local people who understand the context.
Great.
I think just to add to that, Tim, from our perspective, so we're increasingly being asked at Sported to help get those right people around the table, because I think, to Lauren's point, that's the critical piece of this. And I think for too long, in lots of different projects and programs, there have been a number of people around the table, but actually the voice of the community or aspects of the community hasn't been around the table. So if you think about where facilities are placed, or where particular programs are run, or that sort of initial consultation piece of work hasn't fully encompassed the whole community, and that's really impacted on the ability of whatever it is, the program or the facility, to create the change that it was intended to do. So that's a role that we're now playing for several different partners, actually, which we're really excited about, because it's providing the voice that we're desperate for our groups to play a part in that. I think the only other thing I'd say about place-based work is you've got to be in it for the long haul, right? So I think you recognize that things like Model City, fantastic, great, but really over what period are you expecting to see what kind of change? And I think there are certainly things you can measure in year 1, 2, 3 and so on, but actually if you're talking about serious level community change, then you've got to be there, and you've got to be measuring for 5 years plus whatever, haven't you, to really witness what difference that makes. So that's great if you've got a funder or a partner or a stakeholder that's up for that. But that's important. That's important to recognise, I think.
Tim, just one thing to add, some of the work that we're doing with London Sport. So we're starting that, trying to understand those particular local areas by merging different data sets, overlaying different things to understand that context as well from a data point of view. So how far are people from green spaces? How many leisure centres or whatever it might be are available to them? So that gives us the context from the data side. And then, like Lauren and Tom are saying, then actually speaking to the people that are there. So it's just a kind of different angle.
So it's a blend of the kind of more objective data type and the kind of voice of the of the local community. That's really good. Okay, so just looking down at the questions, I've got one about, I think we touched on this, but please shout, whoever posed the question, please shout if you feel it's not been answered. So how do we support parts of the workforce that aren't comfortable with research to become better at interpreting and applying insight to their work? So we touched on the kind of more accessible elements of that. So one of the things I might just plug actually is London Sports Insight and Data Portal, because we're sort of trying to sort of democratize insight and information as well. So that's the source that that's kind of the driver for that site. It's data.londonsport.org if you're interested. Looking at the questions, there's a point actually about more of a point which I'll read out. Tom and Lauren, it's great to hear more about using insight to inform program design and effective demonstration of impact through the Pan London framework. Love to share the Skills Builder Universal Framework, which is being used across sports, youth work, in education and employment. I wasn't aware of this. I don't know if you guys have been. But then there's a question again at the end: what app is Sportage using to collect? I think around the data collection side.
Yeah, so it's an app called Field Notes. And they'll be delighted I'm giving the plug for that. So so it's an app-based thing where we can set a variety of tasks from a central position. So we can ask a number of our groups to download the app, whether it's the group leader or maybe even the young people themselves to download the app. We set tasks centrally for them to respond. So the task being a question, and they have a certain amount of time within which they can respond either by text or by audio or by video, but all on their phone. And that comes straight through to us. It's transcribed. It's ready for us to either use for insight purposes or to develop almost into like a collation of, voices that could be used more in a presentation format. So we haven't actually, we're in the process of that. But it's really exciting for us because I think, as I said, it really allows the voice of our members to come through in a more direct way than it ever has done before. And that's the real power in what we do, is being able to share exactly what they say. So I would wholeheartedly recommend it, even though we haven't yet found it ourselves.
It'd be great to actually share a case study, maybe about how you got on with our network, perhaps insight about insight, if so to speak. But I think that that sort of stuff would be quite quite useful, I think, to a lot of people. So maybe that's something we can take away. So how do the panel make decisions around what to and what not to measure? There is so much data available, and sometimes it's difficult to see the wood from the trees. Yeah, this is one that's, I think, probably familiar to quite a few of us. Any maybe Sanya, I don't know if you, from a kind of a sort of thoroughbred researcher perspective, you might have a view on this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's quite nice. I guess from our point of view, we would want to know from the clients, so whoever it is, what do they need to know? And then we'll build around metrics around that. So like I said, it's critical that we think about what we are deciding to look at, actually what we've left out. But you want to come from a point of view of like thinking about all of that at the start to be able to make those decisions well and critically. I think what works quite well is, I know Lauren was mentioning earlier, like having things uniform. So if there are metrics that are used quite widely, it's always great to embed those into your research. So you've got sort of a basis, and that's like a benchmark, and then you can kind of mushroom and add things. But it comes from honestly thinking about, that endpoint. What do we need to get out of this? What are we measuring? What does the client need to know from our side? And then it's creative, really. And testing and trying and actually piloting. And if something's not quite coming out in the same way, like I said, be dynamic and change stuff.
Yeah, I guess wonder whether either Tom, Rose, or Lauren, you have a view, because you are, from my experience of working with you guys, you're very kind of clear on the outcomes you seek, and that's, I think, for me, that is the almost like the biggest. If you're clear on those, then that puts you on such a stronger path to know what to collect and what not to collect.
Yeah, I think that's it, and I think that's why having those clear outcomes and that clear framework that In Focus helped us develop has really kind of changed or highly improved the way that we have collected insight and information. So if you know your outcomes, then what we have is an indicator bank and a set of indicators that link to each outcome, and then the grantees can choose which indicators they want to measure, but they will always fit into one or more of the outcomes. So that's how we do it. So there is a little bit of kind of some of it can be quite prescriptive, but there's a lot of indicators, and they can also come up with their own if necessary as well, and change things. And like Sanya said, you know, if you need to adapt it or if you need to change it through the life of the project, that's also possible.
Thank you. Moving on. Yeah, sorry, Rose, go for it.
Oh, thanks. From our perspective, there's a few principles that we try and stick to when we're thinking about this. So starting with, is it qualitative or quantitative information that you want? And I'm a quant person. If it's quant, then definitely to use validated questions which are out there and easy to copy, exactly the same wording, so that you know you're asking the question in the right way. And then also to, instead of start with lots of things that you want to ask and then try and cut it down, then you probably will end up with too many things. So to start with the most important things and then add more if you have to, and go about it that way. And then the last thing I'd say is to think about what you're going to be dealing with later. So how you're collecting that information and what format is it going to come in, so that it's then easier for you later to interpret it.
Yeah, so from those practical things are really kind of important, aren't they, as you sort of get into, you know, into the research sort of process. Thank you. Okay, so another question. Have any of the panel had experience of gathering insight from children and young people during the pandemic? If so, is there anything that has worked particularly well or anything which has been less effective engaging children and young people? So let's start with the COVID context, but if there hasn't been any situations where you've collected data through this period, maybe just expand it out to, you know, the children and young people side. Anyone wants to volunteer for that?
Sure.
Go for it. Sorry, I should be more directional. I'll just open it up.
Yes, so during COVID, probably the best example is collecting data for our socially distanced sport pilot. So that was run in July with 2 community groups. Shout out Badu Sports, Salam Peace, they're amazing. So that was run with children and young people, and they were also the ones who were supporting the collection of data, because we find that actually kind of it's sort of like the next step to kind of bringing people into the project and taking ownership is to also take ownership of the research element. So, but obviously there's going to be challenges with that, because sometimes those who were involved in the research weren't able to attend on certain days, or, you know, they'd like hand it over to their friends to do. So sometimes the data wasn't always as accurate as it could be, but it was actually a really from those who were involved in doing that and taking part in the research element, they really felt that they gained an extra skill and they learned something new. So it was an added element to the project, and that's something that I've done in previous projects aside from the GLA as well. So I find that participatory research is really helpful.
Thank you. Any further views on engaging children and young people particularly?
Yeah, I mean, we don't do it per se, because we often operate through group leaders who then themselves would access children and young people. We have done it at times, and we found you know, it can be really of value itself. So we've had quite a number of consultations with girls forming, you know, part of the groups that then talk through. We bring some pizza in, they sit around and talk through some ideas and stuff that is captured as part of that. So it becomes almost an event in itself, which actually they get to share their thoughts and really quite enjoy and feel that they're really contributing. So I think it's slightly different when you're on a project like Lauren's described to when it's a more sort of general question that comes along. So we found it's been important to almost not incentivize it, but make an event of it that feels bigger than, you know, just tacked onto the end of a session almost. So don't profess to be experts, but there's certainly some benefit for the participants as well, I think.
Okay, great, thank you. So going right down from the sort of participant, understanding the participant, right up to perhaps a bit more of the macro policy side. One question for me is, it relates to that: are we doing enough as a sport and physical activity sector to evidence the value that I think we all sort of know and feel that sport and physical activity can provide to the people that, the main, I guess, budget holders, whether they be, I don't know, central government, local government, working in health, working in, I don't know, social services, transport. Where do you think we're at in that kind of picture at the moment?
So from my experience, I've been working in the sector probably 12 years or so now, and there's always been this question about evidence, and to my mind, there's a lot of evidence that is out there about the value of sport and physical activity on a variety of issues. I think the issue for me is about how we've told that story, how we've effectively told that story, which is what comes back to, what Lauren's talking about as a pan-London approach, or, the collaboration piece. How do we effectively sing from the same hymn sheet? How do we collate what we're doing in a way that makes sense to government, whether it's individual departments or to government collectively or other key stakeholders? And I think there's a real need for us to be able to do that better, because I think there's been lots of opportunities, lots of organisations speaking to lots of people over the years, saying similar things but slightly different, and that that's led to a sort of slight confusion about, well, does this really work? Does this work across the board? Does this, and if you compare us to other sectors like the arts, for example, I think you look at how effective they are in the way that they work together and they lobby. I think we have been less so. So I think for me it's less about evidence, it's more about the use of that evidence to drive the change that we need to see. Yeah.
Okay. So one voice and getting the messaging right and joined up. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. There was a question that I've been steering away from because I wanted to ask it at the last one, and it's quite a difficult one, I think. But it's about the kind of known unknowns, if that makes sense. So what do the panel feel are the biggest research and knowledge gaps for the sports sector? So I'm kind of glad I'm on the panel. I'm asking the question. What do you think would make the biggest difference? This is something actually that London Sport is kind of wrestling with, actually, in terms of our internal work. Just while you're thinking about your answer, we've got a new strategy, and we're currently sort of starting to think about, okay, so what do we really need to know to support the effective delivery of our strategy? And it sounds like an easy question, but it's actually probably it's not that easy. There's lots of small questions you come in, and maybe that's right. But yeah, I just wondered if there's anything that you, in your day jobs, you'd wish you knew, or wish your organisation knew.
Yeah, I can have a go, but I mean, I think for me it's partly about sort of attribution levels. So to what extent is it the sport that makes the difference in a person's life versus the other contextual things? So we're brilliant at case studies. We can all talk about the amazing stories of someone that's had their life transformed, and we say transformed by sport. Well, to what extent was that sport versus sport plus a range of things? Of course, I don't think you can never know the answer to that. I certainly don't know how you can find the answer to that, but I think it's easy for detractors of sport, or those that don't want to invest in it, to say, well, that's it's just one of a myriad of things that contributes to a young person's development, for example. So so that's a comment, not a solution.
Yeah,
I'm glad you answered first, Tom. That helped me. But I do actually completely agree with that, because I was just thinking about mental health. It just came into my head because we're talking a lot about how sport can kind of support those with mental health needs, and particularly during lockdown, everyone was allowed out to play, not to play sport, to go for a run or to go for a walk, and to be physically active. So it was very clear, and I think it's been clear that physical activity has a massive role to play in your mental health. But as Tom said, how much of that is physical activity? How much of that is the environment you're in? We don't know. So that is something that would be really interesting to try and figure out.
And I think just to add to that as well, when we're trying to research this or trying to measure it, the diversity of choice in terms of the different sports people can do and the different physical activities makes it, I guess, harder to be like, is it football? No, because someone doesn't like football, but tennis might work for them or dance might work for them. So it makes it hard to aggregate. But if we can find a way of cutting through that, because yeah, Lauren, like you've said, the research we've been doing is clearly showing that, you know, whether it's like sports or music or something, they're playing a critical role in people's well-being at the minute. And it's just cutting through. Can we just very simply measure it? Because I think we feel it. It feels like quite clear that there is an impact. It's just, you know, if we simplify it, is that too simple in order to convince people? But yeah, I think the diversity definitely makes it harder.
Yeah, great. Yeah, not an easy question, but I can't. My answer would have been very similar, I think, to you guys around that whole. Yeah, the attribution. What are the driving factors, and really trying to understand them. But at a population level, I think that's really difficult because of the diversity. Great. Okay. Well, with 3 minutes to go, so I think we'll leave it there. I'll just check that we haven't had any questions since. No, I don't think we have. So yeah, that's been a really fantastic conversation. Everybody we touched on a whole loads of stuff. We sort of looked at right down into the insight, understanding the Londoner, the individual, the organisations that operate and deliver physical activity, and then back up to the policy context. I think key themes that came out for me are collaboration. I think there's huge potential in London and probably beyond for further sharing of insight, in particular, is almost like a starting point. But then, yeah, the shared measurement and joining up around that offers significant potential too. So maybe as part of this session, if people who are part of the session are interested in collaborating, I think, you know, it'd be good to kind of maybe start to form maybe a coalition of the willing, so to speak, and maybe run more sessions like this around sort of insight topics. It's something that we've been talking about at London Sport, and I think obviously Lauren touched on it around how they might create some, you know, sort of research type, insight type network or thought leadership sharing. So I think we'll take that away, but please do get in touch if you're interested in it, or indeed you have any further thoughts about anything that came out of today, because we'd love to kind of get your thoughts as well. So massive thank you to Tom, Sanya, Lauren and Rose. And I do think actually that draws Active London to a close. I think it's the last, there's another session going on parallel, but I think that's the last session of really insightful, useful 4 days. So thank you to everybody's attendance and input. So yeah, thanks again, and we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.